So I wanted to go back and talk to you about this assignment. This was the number 64 worksheet where you guys were asked to find the inverse stating any necessary restrictions. I want to have a quick conversation with you about this because I was not really satisfied with anyone's answers 100%, and I will have a question on your test that is very specific to this topic. So be careful and pay close attention. I'll try to explain it so that you guys are clarified. So let me see if I can find. First of all, I have graphed for you the quadratic x squared minus 9, which is the problem that was right here, x squared minus 9. I'm discussing this restriction. As you can see on this problem right here, we have a quadratic, which you should recognize. If you solve this, you rewrite it with a y, switch the x and y, and then solve for y. Then this is the function that you end up with. And let me address real quickly the fact that I could not call this, I could not write, Desmos does not like the inverse notation, the f raised to the -1. If you type that in there, you get an error over here and it doesn't graph anything. So that's why I had to just rename it g of x. But if you turn that on, hopefully you quickly recognize that this right here is not the inverse of this quadratic. It's only half of it. That's because when you take the square root of both sides of an equal sign, you have to include both the positive and the negative values of it. So the piece that's missing, did I call that? No, J. The piece that's missing is that the bottom part that goes over here, and we get that up there by saying, by putting the negative in front of the square root. Okay, so now we see that we've got, so if you're typing it on Desmos, to get the full inverse, you have to do both the positive and the negative. If you're writing it, then when you, as you write it, you would go, here's how you'd find it. You would rewrite this with a y. You would switch the x and y. You would solve for y, add 9 to both sides. Get x plus 9 equals y squared. You take the square root of both sides, and it's this step right here where you end up with the plus or minus x plus 9 equals y. And this, when you start off with a quadratic, it really takes two pieces to get the entire inverse. Now, the problem with this, both pieces of this, is that this is not a function, and which is exactly why Desmos writes it in two pieces, because you have to restrict it. So in order for us to only talk about either the positive part or just the negative part, then this top part up here has to be restricted. And the way that I gave you the restriction when I gave you the worksheet, I said, let's only look at the positive x values. Okay, so the way you type that in here is you put the little braces and you say, I only want the positive x values. And so now we have the quadratic restricted, and we can see that we no longer need both pieces, but which piece do we need? Well, since these are positive x values over here, we only need the positive y values. Those are the inverses. See, we switch the x and y. This is 3, 0. So switch the x and y, and it becomes 0, 3. Oh, for goodness sakes, there it is. It becomes 0, 3. So we don't need this green one. So the way that we show the restriction when we get down here is to not include both of these, but to restrict it. If this says restrict the positive, only use positive x values, then when we get down here, we're not going to report the negatives. We're only going to do the positive values of that square root function. Okay, so in reverse of that, if we start off with a square root function, and this one, see, started off here with the negative y values. So when you move over here to look at this one, if you look at the graph of it, this is the graph of that first part. That's the red one, obviously down here. If you solve it, and let's talk about solving it real quick, because I saw lots of mistakes with this one and this negative. You write it in the way that it's given, rewrite it with the y, switch the x and y. And then you have to solve for y, which means you need to square both sides to get rid of that 1/2. When you square, we're squaring right here a negative number. What happens when you square a negative number? It becomes a positive. So this negative sign multiplies out and becomes a positive. Lots of people were messing up with this negative sign. And when you raise something to the 1/2 power and then you square it, you multiply 1/2 times 2, that goes to 1, which is exactly what we wanted. So we squared both sides, and now we're going to subtract the 3. So this becomes x squared minus 3 equals y. So you type this equation in right here and you get this entire graph. Well, remember, we're showing the restriction right here with the negative y values. So you're gonna need to impose the restriction here that we want the negative x values. And now we get the inverse functions. And how do we know for sure that they're inverse functions? We'll pick any point. Here's one that's 0, 3 on the inverse, the quadratic part. So switch the x and y, and that's going to become -3, 0. And you go over here to this one, and there's the point -3, 0. You can also check this point. It's -1.730. Switch the x and y, that becomes 0, -1.732. So you can see that those are inverses of each other. But here's the restriction on the square root function, and here's the restriction on the quadratic function. So both parts of a quadratic and a square root function show the restrictions for the domain. The restriction on the square root, though, is sometimes not as obvious. Sometimes it is with the negative, but if that had been the other way around, the restriction here is not as obvious. It's the implied positive in front right there that shows the restriction. So here, if I ask you to explain where do you see the restriction here, you could maybe say it's the absence of the negative. There's not a positive and a negative. The absence of the negative is the restriction. That's the implied positive values. And then the restriction on the quadratics is a lot easier to see. I just want to make sure you guys understand that part.